It began as an ordinary, quiet California night, the kind where porch lights glow softly and neighbors assume tomorrow will come as it always does. But just beyond the hedges of a well-kept Brentwood condominium, something unspeakable was waiting to be discovered. Shortly after midnight on June 12, 1994, a passerby noticed a dog wandering restlessly along South Bundy Drive. Its paws were smeared with blood. The animal tugged at its leash, leading the witness toward a narrow walkway beside a condo. What lay at the end of that path would stop an entire nation in its tracks. There, under the faint yellow glow of exterior lights, were two bodies. Nicole Brown Simpson, 35 years old, lay near the front steps of her home. She was barefoot. Her body was positioned awkwardly, as though she had tried and failed to escape. Nearby was Ronald Goldman, 25, a waiter, an aspiring actor who had simply come by to return a forgotten pair of glasses. The scene was brutal beyond comprehension. Nicole had been stabbed repeatedly. Her throat was slashed so deeply it nearly decapitated her. Ron Goldman's body bore signs of a violent struggle. Defensive wounds on his hands, deep stab wounds across his torso, blood pooling beneath him as if the ground itself had absorbed his final moments. The concrete, the walls, even nearby plants were stained with violence. This was not a quick act. It was personal, furious, overkill. To understand the weight of that night, you must understand who Nicole and Ron were before they became names in a case file. Nicole Brown was more than a tabloid headline. Friends described her as warm, gentle, and devoted to her children. She loved hosting dinners, decorating her home, and creating a sense of normalcy after her divorce. But beneath that carefully built life was fear. Fear shaped by years of alleged domestic abuse during her marriage to a man the world adored. That man was Parental James Simpson. Once hailed as a football legend, movie star, and advertising icon, Simpson lived a life of privilege and fame. To the public, he was charming, charismatic, and untouchable. To Nicole, according to police reports and friends, he was controlling, jealous, and violent. Over the years, Nicole had called the police multiple times, documenting bruises, threats, and terror that never fully left her eyes. Ron Goldman, by contrast, had no connection to that history. He was a kind-hearted young man known for his loyalty and optimism. He worked long shifts, dreamed of a better future, and on that night, he was simply doing favor. He never should have been there. He never expected danger. His life ended because he crossed paths with someone else's rage. When police arrived, even seasoned detectives were shaken. The sheer savagery of the attack suggested a killer who knew Nicole, someone fueled by intense emotion. Blood drops led away from the bodies, hinting that the murderer had been injured. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by flashing lights and whispered disbelief. Within hours, one question began to echo louder than all the others. Who could commit something this violent, and why? As crime scene investigators worked through the night, carefully photographing bloodstains and collecting evidence soaked in horror, one name began circulating quietly among detectives, then loudly across Los Angeles: Simpson. The connection was immediate and unavoidable. Nicole Brown Simpson was his ex-wife. Their marriage had been turbulent, marked by repeated police calls, documented injuries, and frantic 911 recordings when Nicole's fear was unmistakable. Even in death, her past followed her to the crime scene. Detectives noted disturbing details almost immediately. The attack showed rage, not robbery. No valuables were taken. The killer came armed, struck with precision, and continued long after death was certain. This wasn't random violence. It was intimate, and intimacy pointed in one direction. When police went to Simpson's Rockingham estate just hours after bodies were found, they noticed something troubling. Simpson had a visible cut on one of his fingers, a deep gash he struggled to explain. Inside his home and vehicle, investigators would later report finding traces of blood. Outside, on the dark path leading to his front door, a single leather glove lay on the ground. Its match later found near Nicole's body, but before the evidence could fully speak, something else took over the case. Television. On June 17, 1994, O.J. Simpson was scheduled to turn himself in. He agreed, through his attorneys, to turn himself in at the Los Angeles Police Department, but he never arrived. Instead, that evening, police were alerted that Simpson was riding in a white Ford Bronco driven by his friend and former NFL teammate Al Cowlings. Simpson was reportedly in the back seat, emotionally distraught and allegedly holding a gun to his head. What followed became one of the most famous events in television history. LAPD pursued the Bronco in a low-speed chase across Southern California freeways. The chase was broadcast live on national television. Millions of Americans watched, including viewers whose regular programming, such as the NBA Finals, was interrupted. After nearly 2 hours, the Bronco arrived at Simpson's estate on Rockingham Avenue in Brentwood. Following negotiations, Simpson exited the vehicle and was taken into custody without resistance later that night. As Simpson was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, the case crossed a line from tragedy into history. Every move would be dissected, every piece of evidence debated, every emotion politicized. What began as blood on a quiet walkway had become a legal battle that would divide America along lines of race, fame, and trust in the justice system. And the most disturbing question still loomed. If the evidence was so overwhelming, how could the truth ever be agreed upon? Simpson entered the courtroom. The world followed. Cameras captured every glance, every whisper, every flicker of emotion. But beyond the polish with benches and tailored suits lay something far more unsettling: the evidence. Soaked in blood, controversy, and doubt, prosecutors laid out a chilling forensic trail that, on paper, seemed almost impossible to escape. Blood consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson, and Ron Goldman was found at the crime scene. Drops of blood led away from the bodies, suggesting the killer had been injured during the attack. That same blood trail appeared again, inside Simpson's white Ford Bronco, smeared along the door panels, soaked into the carpeting. At Simpson's Rockingham estate, investigators reported blood drops on the driveway and near the entrance to his home, as if someone had arrived wounded and tried to hide it. The implication was terrifyingly clear. The killer had bled, and the blood followed him home. Then there were the gloves. A dark leather glove lay near Nicole's body, stiff with dried blood. Another, nearly identical glove was discovered behind Simpson's home, partially hidden near an air conditioning unit. Prosecutors argued they were a pair, a silent bridge between the murder scene and the suspect's house. Hair fibers, bloodstains, and DNA were presented as proof that these gloves had been worn during the killings. But the defense saw opportunity where the prosecution saw certainty. They attacked the handling of evidence relentlessly. Vials of blood, they argued, were stored improperly. Samples were collected without gloves. Evidence moved between locations without airtight documentation. In a case this massive, any mistake became a weapon. Then came the moment that would echo through legal history. In front of the jury, Simpson was asked to try on the gloves. He struggled, tugged, grimaced. The gloves appeared tight, painfully so. His fingers curled awkwardly, unable to slide in fully. The courtroom fell silent as the image burned into the minds of jurors and viewers alike. If it doesn't fit, the defense would later argue, you must acquit. But beneath that dramatic moment was a deeper, darker fracture forming in the case. Detective Mark Furman, a key prosecution witness, took the stand. He had found the glove at Simpson's home. He had been among the first officers on the scene. His credibility mattered. Then the tapes emerged. Recordings of Furman using racist slurs, expressing hatred toward black people, and boasting about police misconduct. Under oath, Furman denied ever using such language, a denial that would later unravel. The defense suggested something explosive. That Furman, motivated by racism, may have planted evidence to frame Simpson. The idea was shocking. To some, unthinkable. To others, disturbingly plausible given the history of police misconduct in Los Angeles, still scarred by the Rodney King beating and riots just years earlier. And all of a sudden, the trial wasn't just about murder. It was about trust. Could the jury trust the police? Could they trust forensic science? Could they trust a system that had failed so many before? As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the courtroom became a battleground not just for facts, but for belief. Every drop of blood told a story, but which story the jury would believe was no longer certain. Outside the courthouse, Families watched helplessly. Nicole's loved one saw her life reduced to exhibits and arguments. Ron Goldman's parents listened as their son's final moments were dissected by strangers, his death becoming secondary to a larger cultural war. And through it all, one question haunted the room. Was the truth being revealed or buried under doubt? As the trial dragged on, tension thickened inside and outside the courtroom. What had begun as a murder case had transformed into something far larger, a referendum on justice, race, fame, and power in America. Every testimony, every objection, every facial expression from O.J. Simpson was scrutinized as if it carried hidden meaning. By late 1995, the jury had heard months of evidence, bloodstains, DNA statistics, crime scene photos too disturbing to forget. They had listened to experts explain how a knife could slice through muscle and bone, how defensive wounds form when a victim desperately tries to stop an attack, how blood spatter reveals movement, struggle, and fury. They had heard how Ron Goldman likely fought for his life, how his hands bore cuts from grabbing the blade, how his body absorbed blow after blow until he collapsed, bleeding out on the concrete. They had also heard about mistakes, evidence bags left open, blood samples carried in ways they shouldn't have been, a detective whose racism cast a long, poisonous shadow over the investigation. Each flaw chipped away at certainty, feeding the defense's central argument, reasonable doubt. As closing arguments approached, the emotional weight became unbearable for the victims' families. Nicole's relatives sat silently, haunted by the knowledge that her history of abuse, documented, reported, and ignored, had ended exactly as she once feared. Ron Goldman's parents wrestled with a different pain. Their son had no warning, no history, no chance. His life was erased in a moment of misplaced kindness. The defense focused on doubt with surgical precision. They reminded jurors that DNA evidence, no matter how powerful, could be compromised by human error. They emphasized that if even one piece of evidence was mishandled, the entire case became unreliable. And they returned again and again to the glove, that haunting image of Simpson struggling to pull on, frozen in time. The prosecution, by contrast, urged the jury to look at the totality of evidence. They argued that no conspiracy could explain blood from the victims appearing at the crime scene, in Simpson's car and at his home. They described a timeline in which Simpson had enough time to commit the murders, return home, and prepare for a late-night flight, all while bleeding from a cut consistent with a knife injury. Psychological experts later described Simpson's courtroom demeanor as controlled, detached, a man accustomed to being admired, not accused. Some saw calm, others saw calculation. To supporters, he looked like an innocent man under siege. To critics, he looked like someone confident the system would bend. Then came October 3rd, 1995. The courtroom filled. Outside, crowds gathered. Offices turned on televisions. Millions of people across the world held their breath as the jury filed in. The verdict was read quickly. Not guilty. Not guilty. The words landed like an explosion. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Nicole's family collapsed into tears. Ron Goldman's mother let out a cry that cut through the room. Across America, reactions split sharply. Some celebrated, cheering in the streets. Others stared at their screens in disbelief, convinced they had just witnessed justice fail in real time. For many Black Americans, the verdict felt like rare accountability, a moment where a system long accused of racial bias finally failed to convict without certainty. For many others, it felt like fame and money had once again shielded someone from consequences. But one truth was unavoidable. 2 people were dead, and no one was going to prison for it. The acquittal did not bring peace. It did not bring closure. Instead, it opened a wound that refused to heal. Conversations turned bitter. Families withdrew from public life. The case became a symbol, replayed endlessly, argued passionately, and never truly resolved in the public mind. And yet, the story was far from over. Because while the criminal court had spoken, another courtroom was waiting. One with a lower burden of proof, and families desperate for accountability. In the days after the acquittal, grief hardened into resolve for the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. If the criminal court could not hold O.J. Simpson accountable, they would seek justice elsewhere. A different courtroom, a different standard, a final chance to be heard. In 1996, the families filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Simpson. This time, the burden was not beyond a reasonable doubt, but a lower threshold, a preponderance of the evidence. More likely than not, for the Goldmans especially, this wasn't about money. It was about truth, about having a jury say out loud that Ron's life mattered and that what happened to him was wrong. The civil trial peeled away the spectacle and left something raw behind. Without the glare of nonstop television cameras, jurors listened closely to evidence that had once been drowned out by controversy. Blood patterns were revisited, timelines tightened, witnesses testified again, calmer, clearer, stripped of theatrics. The story that emerged was not about conspiracy or planted evidence, but about violence rooted in obsession. Prosecutors emphasized Nicole's documented history of abuse, photos of bruises, police reports, 911 calls where her voice trembled with fear. Experts explain how domestic violence often escalates after separation, how control turns into rage when an abuser realizes they no longer own the person they once dominated. Psychologists described a dangerous mix: entitlement, jealousy, humiliation, and narcissism. To someone like Simpson, adored by millions and used to rejection, Nicole's independence could have felt like annihilation. Her life moving forward without him wasn't just a loss. It was an insult. Ron Goldman's death was framed as tragic inevitability. Experts explain how he likely interrupted the attack, becoming an immediate threat to the killer's escape. His defensive wounds told the story of a man who fought desperately, realizing too late that kindness had led him into a slaughter. The jury heard how the violence against Ron was swift, ferocious, and silencing, not personal, but merciless. In 1997, the civil jury reached its decision. They found Simpson liable for the deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. Damages were set at $33.5 million. For the families, the verdict brought a fragile sense of validation. Someone had finally said what they believed all along, that these deaths were not accidents, not mysteries, not media illusions. They were the result of deliberate violence. But justice once again came with limits. Simpson did not go to prison. The money awarded was never fully paid. Assets were protected. Years passed. The families carried their grief forward, knowing that accountability had arrived, but not in the way they had hoped. The community felt it too. Brentwood would never be just a quiet neighborhood again. The case had changed how people viewed celebrity, policing, and domestic abuse. Nicole's death became a grim reminder of how often warning signs are ignored until it's too late. And still, one haunting reality remained. A civil verdict can say liable, but cannot say guilty. As time moved on, Simpson faded from the courtroom, but not from controversy. The shadow of the case followed him everywhere, and years later, that shadow would collide with another violent crime, raising chilling questions about patterns, accountability, and whether the past ever truly lets go. Time passed, but the case never loosened its grip. For O.J. Simpson, freedom after the civil verdict did not bring redemption. It brought isolation. Once celebrated as a national hero, he became a symbol of something darker. Television roles vanished. Endorsements evaporated. Friends distanced themselves. Wherever he went, whispers followed. The families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman, meanwhile, lived with a different burden. The knowledge that the man they believed responsible for their loved one's deaths was still free. The civil judgment stood, but the money remained largely unpaid. Each year that passed felt like a reminder that justice, once diluted, is hard to reclaim. Psychologists often speak of unresolved accountability as a dangerous force. When consequences feel incomplete, behavior does not correct. It adapts. In 2007, that theory seemed to take a terrifying form. Simpson was arrested in Las Vegas after leading a group of men into a hotel room where sports memorabilia dealers were staying. Armed confrontation followed. Witnesses described shouting, threats, and fear. Guns were present. Doors were blocked. The scene carried echoes of dominance, entitlement, and control. Familiar patterns that experts had long associated with Simpson's past. This time, there was no national debate, no celebrity shield. In 2008, Simpson was convicted of armed robbery and kidnapping and sentenced to 33 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9. When the sentence was read, Some saw irony. Others saw delayed consequences. Many quietly felt something closer to grim inevitability. Nicole and Ron's families watched from a distance. There was no celebration, only a sense that a cycle had finally turned. Not because of the murders, not because of the blood on South Bundy Drive, but because eventually the patterns caught up. Experts revisited the original case with renewed intensity. They pointed out how violence often escalates when unchecked, how power, once tested and reinforced, seeks new expressions, how individuals who believe they are untouchable may take greater risks over time. The psychological profile hadn't changed. What had changed was the system's willingness to stop him. When Simpson was granted parole in 2017, he emerged into a world forever shaped by his name. He insisted on innocence. He avoided direct discussion of the murders. But the silence spoke loudly. The unanswered questions remained, embedded in every interview, every public appearance, every mention of Nicole and Ron. For the community, the case had become a permanent scar. Police training changed. Domestic violence awareness grew. Media ethics were questioned. The trial became a case study taught in law schools, psychology courses, and journalism programs worldwide. Yet beneath all the analysis, one truth remained painfully human. 2 lives were taken in a burst of violence so intense it still chills those who study it. And no amount of time could erase that night. All that was left now were the questions no verdict ever answered, about motive, rage, and the thin line between love and control. Even now, decades later, the night on South Bundy Drive refuses to rest. The blood has long been washed from the concrete. The condominium changed hands. The cameras moved on. Yet the questions remain sharp, unresolved, and deeply human. What truly happened in those final minutes? Investigators reconstructed the scene again and again. A sudden confrontation, a knife drawn, a violent eruption of rage. Experts believe the attack was fast but ferocious, the kind of violence fueled not by logic, but by emotions spiraling out of control. Nicole likely never had time to understand what was happening. Ron Goldman likely realized too late that he had walked into a nightmare he could not escape. Some still ask whether justice was served at all. A criminal acquittal, a civil liability, a later prison sentence for a different crime. Each outcome answers a question, but never the one that mattered most to the families who lost everything. Did the verdict reveal the truth, or did it expose the limits of truth in a world shaped by fame, money, and doubt? For Nicole Brown Simpson, the legacy is tragic clarity. Her story has become a symbol of domestic violence, ignored until it ends in death. Her 911 calls are still played in training rooms, reminders of voices that begged for help and were not heard loudly enough. For Ron Goldman, the loss is quieter, but no less devastating. A young man with dreams, friendships, and kindness in his heart, erased simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His death forces an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes innocence offers no protection at all. For the public, the case remains a mirror. It forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about who we believe, who we doubt, and how easily narratives can overpower evidence. It challenges us to question whether justice is something we discover or something we negotiate. And for those who still study the case, one final mystery lingers above all others. If the warning signs were so clear, if the fear was so well documented, why did it still end this way? Perhaps that is the most chilling lesson of all, that tragedy often announces itself long before it arrives, and we only recognize it when it's far too late. Now the question is yours. What do you believe happened that night? Was justice served, or merely delayed and distorted? Were the signs ignored, or was the outcome inevitable? Share your thoughts, theories, and reflections in the comments. And if you want more deeply researched, emotionally powerful true crime stories, subscribe and turn on notifications. Because some stories don't just ask what happened, they ask why.